Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I want to talk about two topics that are a little bit connected. The first part is that people in Germany are finally getting a little more dissatisfied and a little less content with the work of our government and of key figures. According to recent surveys, the popularity of Angela Merkel, for example, but also other prominent CDU politicians and the satisfaction with the work of the government in general has been declining. And the second part is an update to my last video from the weekend that was about the creative ways in which certain members of the German Koch party were improving their income, making active use of the crisis in which we are since the beginning of last year. But before we start, I want to thank all my supporters and my subscribers. If you like my content, make sure to like, share and subscribe, and especially join me on all media platforms. If you want to help out my channel, you can do so directly via PayPal or use Patreon or Subscribestar. The links are down in the description below. Alright, so let's look at the first part. Let's look at the surveys that have been conducted in Germany. So the situation until a couple of weeks ago was the following. As Angela Merkel's party went pretty straight from downplaying and denying any risk in the very beginning of last year to positioning themselves as the political power, the political party that is pro-lockdown, pro-severe restrictions, doing whatever it takes in order to get the numbers down. In these times of perceived crisis, Germans normally flock around the banner of security. And that is what was useful for Angela Merkel and her ilk. And you saw that in their popularity values. They were soaring while Germans were locked up at home and had to suffer from severe restrictions. The worse the crisis became, the more popular the Union Party, CDU and CSU became, and the more popular Angela Merkel became once again. But this has changed recently. While they are not yet at these low levels before this crisis began, we can see that their popularity has decreased. And this has many reasons. It is not only connected to the thing that I talked about last time and that I will continue with by the end of the video in the second part. That means these corruption cases that are surfacing now. I think this decrease in popularity has another origin because it started earlier. I think that people are just sick and tired of all these measures and that they realize that in some cases the harm that the cure does is worse than the disease, so to speak, quite literally here. They also saw that the big catastrophe that these politicians then all of a sudden talked about from March or April last year, the thing that they still denied in January and February, while people like me were warning the public, these horrible scenarios, these worst case scenarios, they never actually became reality. When you take a sober look at the numbers, you see there is nothing going on in Germany. In February, for example, we have a mortality that is way below the average of the past 4 years. So we have a health crisis where much less people are dying. That is something to ponder on, I think. And more to the point, more specifically, you see here the popularity traces of Angela Merkel, Jens Spahn and Peter Altmaier. Angela Merkel is, of course, the chancellor. She is responsible for the work of the government. Then Jens Spahn is the health minister and Peter Altmaier is the minister for the economy. And I think it is not a stretch to say that the way that the German government is handling this crisis is seen negatively or critically by more and more Germans. That goes, of course, for the whole mask disaster and for the immunization disaster right now, but also the subsidies for small businesses that never come through, while big businesses and especially international or American corporations are getting a lot of money from the German taxpayer. That is making people dissatisfied and angry. When it comes to certain questions like how the school system and daycare, the jab and testing and restrictions and all these things are handled, you see that an overwhelming majority of Germans, or of the survey participants at least in this case, are dissatisfied with the way that business is handled rather than satisfied with the work of the government. Okay, now let's talk about the second part, the update to the video from last weekend. The story is evolving, and now I heard that the two main suspects that I talked about in my last video, they have reacted now to the allegations. Mr. Nüsslein, for example, he left the CSU party, and Mr. Löbel also left the CDU. Mr. Löbel also stepped down from his office in the German Bundestag. He's no longer a member of parliament, if I understood that correctly. Which is, of course, not the same thing as leaving the party. Sometimes people leave the party and then they are an unaffiliated member of parliament. He didn't choose that path. He said, I am stepping down from my mandate here, and maybe he was forced and pressured. Maybe people said, look, we will come after you if you don't do that. And the reason for that is quite simply that Germans are really enraged by these things. Yeah, when somebody makes a little more money than you do, then Germans get angry. There is a widespread culture of envy and jealousy in Germany. Now, I'm not saying that these are just really hardworking people who made a little bit extra on the side and they deserve it. No. I said very clearly on the weekend that I think that these politicians were really doing something that is wrong here, because they were abusing their position as a public servant in order to get some favors from the industry. And while these things might not be directly illegal, well, I don't know what other things will still be uncovered, but in some cases they might not be really illegal, but it is at least in a gray area. And I repeat once again, nobody in their right mind would pay a consultancy these horrendous fees for what they actually did. There must have been some other service that they provided, like passing on confidential information, or maybe making sure that company X gets a public deal, a public contract that is funded by taxpayers' money, which is of course a classic case of corruption. But these things are of course still under investigation. And because the voters are getting really dissatisfied, the parties react. They are in a state of panic right now. Faction leaders and party leaders are declaring now that this is absolutely unacceptable and we will come after you, and there is a code of conduct that they want to present now. They also discuss that if you want to have a side gig, some side income, then a party commission will have to give you green light for that. Like, you have to ask mommy if you can have a side job. And then mommy says, well, only if your grades don't go down. As long as you have straight A's, you can have a side job. And they also threatened to make everything public. So all the names of all the politicians who were somehow involved in negotiating deals or introducing this one to that one. So they're basically saying you have time until next week to come forth, or we will disclose all the names of all the people that we found out are involved in such acts. Okay, to sum up, I will say about that this reveals pretty much, or this is a good example of how Germans think, the German voters that is, and you see how fast politicians can act if they see that their future success in elections is in danger. And as I said last time already, we have upcoming regional elections. I will cover them, of course, and there are many elections in 2021 in Germany, and these parties, they are getting cold feet. They are in panic mode right now, and they're trying to do everything they can to assure voters that they're taking this seriously. And this is because of this culture of envy in Germany. When German voters get to think that some of these politicians were using the crisis in order to enrich themselves, that weighs much heavier than all the other destructive and horrible, evil things that they've done in the last decade, or especially since 2015, for example. And this is what's so funny about German people. Take me, for example. If I had to come up with a list of reasons why I am dissatisfied with Angela Merkel's government, I think that these irregularities around the procurement of masks would be very, very low on my list of peeves, actually. There are much more destructive things that they have done, but nobody seems to talk about that. Open the borders, make our country unsafe for our children, no problem. But hey, you were involved in a mask deal. Now I don't vote for you anymore. That is pretty much the mindset of the typical normie who votes for Angela Merkel's party. Alright, that was my little breakdown. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Take care. Servus, Kameraden.